Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is The Blond Knight of Germany, Chapter 6, Oak Leaves. War is not exactly a life insurance. Hans-Ulrich Rudel. Once Erich reached 150 victories in the autumn of 1943, his climb to fame proceeded rapidly on both sides of the lines. German propaganda broadcasts began occasionally mentioning his name. His photograph appeared sometimes in newspapers, usually with other leading fighter pilots of JG-52. To the Russians, he became known first as Karaya 1, his radio transmitter designation. Later, he became infamous on the Soviet side as the Black Devil of the South. The legend of the Black Devil began when Erich had a black nose painted on his aircraft, a distinctive pattern shaped like tulip petals. His fighter was easily distinguishable in combat, and the Soviet flyers quickly realized that the pilot of this black-marked German fighter was a foe to be avoided. He never missed. The feared but as yet otherwise unidentified German pilot was nicknamed Black Devil of the South by the Russians. The Soviets had their listening posts and monitored Luftwaffe ground-to-air communications, as did the Germans in gathering intelligence about their foes. These monitored broadcasts made it obvious to the Russians that Karaya 1 and the Black Devil they had come to fear were the same man. He was cutting a swath through their formations, and most of the Black Devil's victories were over single-engine fighters. A price of 10,000 rubles was placed upon the Black Devil's head. The Russian pilot who could bring him down would win fame, glory, and wealth. These inducements proved insufficient. Red pilots, encountering and identifying the Black Devil's distinctively marked aircraft, quickly left the scene of battle. Erich found that his black markings and black image in the minds of the Soviet pilots were working against him. His scores began to diminish as contact with the enemy declined. He was lucky to get in one strike before the enemy fighters dispersed, and the fortunes of every schwarm in which Erich flew with the black aircraft declined sharply. Erich countered first by giving the black-marked aircraft to his green wingmen. These youngsters could have had no better protection. The red fighters left the pilot of the machine with the tulip pattern nose severely alone, but it was still the same story. As long as the black petals were in the air, red opponents were hard to find. Erich concluded that the black petals had to go. Bimmel Mertens was overjoyed. Keeping up the pretty black paint job was an extra chore for him that he didn't particularly enjoy. Bimmel could also count. He knew that the trophies of the hunt had declined since the pattern was first painted on his young chief's ship. Bimmel erased the black tulips, and to the unsuspecting red pilots, Erich became just another Me-109 in a typical schwarm. The difference in scoring heartened not only Erich and Bimmel, but the whole squadron. The victories began coming thick and fast again as Erich lit into the red formations with the advantage of anonymity. In January and February 1944, Karaya 1 seemed to be everywhere and always on the victor's end of the battles. In this 60-day period, Erich ran up a staggering 50 victories, an average of nearly 1 kill per day. Actually, the average was about 2 downings for every flying day. Bad weather was almost as serious an enemy as the Red Air Force, in spite of all the Germans had learned from the Soviet enemies about contenting with the weather. The Germans were astonished in Russia when red fighters swarmed over their airfields early on sub-zero mornings when they had been unable even to start their own aircraft. When Erich's squadron captured a Russian airman, he showed them with typical Soviet directness how the Russian Air Force maintained its operational effectiveness at 40 below zero. The cooperative prisoner was proud of knowing something perhaps the Germans didn't know. He called for half a gallon of gasoline in a can. He went over to one of the grounded Messerschmitts and, to the horror of the watching JG-52 personnel, poured the gasoline into the aircraft's oil sump. The Germans backed away 20 yards or more. The moment that Dummkopf turned on the ignition and attempted a start, there would be an explosion. Apprehensive mechanics began cranking the motor by hand, while a German pilot cringed down in the cockpit. After the gasoline was thoroughly mixed with the congealed oil, he turned on the ignition, and the engine started. There was no explosion. The big Daimler-Benz burst into life and ran solidly. The Russian airmen explained through interpreting Germans that the oil congealed at sub-zero temperatures and made it impossible for the starters to budge the engine. The gasoline liquefied the oil and then evaporated as the engine warmed up. The only necessary precaution was to change engine oil more often when using gasoline for sub-zero starting. Erich also watched another captured Russian demonstrate a sub-zero starting gimmick. He tells the story in his own words. This prisoner called for a spare parts tray. Again, there was a call for gasoline. While Bimmel and others watched, the Russian stalked over to a nearby Me-109 and set the tray on the ground underneath the engine compartment. He filled the tray brimming with gasoline, then he lit a match and sprang back. The gasoline vapor flared alight despite the sub-zero temperature, and a white tongue of flame licked at the underside of the fighter's opened engine compartment. For a full 10 minutes, the blaze continued. One of the mechanics said that the electrical system would be ruined, the insulation all burned away as the flames died down. The Russian simply said, "Start it." The instant, smooth roar of that motor convinced everyone. Fighters could be started in sub-zero weather once you knew how. We all felt indebted to the Red Air Force for this scheme, which helped us get into the air to meet their early morning sorties. The same Russian prisoner gladly showed the awed Germans how to keep their armament functioning in sub-zero climates. Luftwaffe manuals recommended careful lubrication and greasing for gun mechanisms. The grease congealed on the Russian front and froze the breech mechanism shut. The Russian took a German machine gun and dunked it in a tank of boiling water, flushing all the grease and oil out of the weapon. Minus its recommended lubricants, the gun functioned perfectly at 40 below zero. Thanks to Russian advice, the Germans were not only able to keep flying, but also to keep firing, a problem that had dogged Luftwaffe units in the first 2 winters in Russia. With Bimmel using all these tricks and more, Erich was able to rack up his impressive string of kills over the January to February period in 1944. He flew a normally camouflaged fighter, and its only distinguishing mark was the bleeding Ush heart on the fuselage. The Russians nevertheless matched up the plane and pilot through radio interceptions. This led to Erich's being singled out one morning by a Russian determined to down him. Erich was flying with his wingman, Lieutenant Vesta, far back in German territory on the Romanian front. Behind the lines there was normally little likelihood of encountering Russian aircraft, but reports had come into JG-52 HQ of ground attacks behind the lines. Erich was ordered to make a sweep. With over 500 combat missions under his belt, Erich had acquired something that he considered even more valuable than the 150 victories standing to his credit: an intuition for the enemy presence. The blue sky seemed empty save for some cumulus insufficient to conceal an enemy aircraft for long. The earth below showed no evidence of the mortal struggle seesawing across its face. Then Erich's ESP rang the little danger signal in his mind that was to save him many times. He looked back. Sitting on the perch 600 yards behind and above him was a single red-nosed Yak fighter. The Russian was about to make a pass on Karaya 1. "Pull ahead of me, climb up and watch," Erich told Vesta. As they went racing along, the Russian every few seconds would try to open fire. Watching carefully, Erich broke away each time, trying to get the Russian to overtake him on the outside. The red pilot then did the last thing Erich expected. Pulling up, he turned and came head on. Erich fired and the Russian fired. No hits either way. Twice they fired their way through a head-on encounter. Neither of them could get a better firing position. After 2 near misses at high speed, Erich began his out-loud talking to himself that he resorted to in tight spots. "Erich, this Russian acts like he is mad. He's probably trying to ram you. Break away from him, come on, with negative Gs." The Blond Knight pushed his stick forward and sent Karaya 1 down in a negative G maneuver instead of continuing his turn. He called to Vesta to escape down in a steep dive. As his fighter went plunging down, Erich watched the Russian continue his turn. From underneath, Erich could see the now confused red pilot making a couple of quick turns, obviously rattled because he could no longer find his German antagonist. Without spotting Erich below him in the dead zone, the Russian turned east and headed for home, no doubt full of his tale of how he almost bushwhacked the infamous Karaya 1, the Black Devil. Firewalling his throttle, Erich followed at low level directly under his adversary. Climbing steadily, with the 109's engine wide open, in 2 minutes Erich had come up under the unsuspecting Yak. Throttling back less than 50 feet below the Russian machine, Erich lifted the nose, and as the enemy fighter filled his windshield with its bulk, he pressed his gun buttons. Clunks of jagged metal flew off the Russian fighter in a deadly hail and thundered against the wings of Karaya 1. Fire blowtorched out of the Russian's engine compartment, and a pall of black smoke trailed back behind the stricken fighter. The Yak was done for. The Russian pilot inverted his dying machine and bailed out. His chute billowing white against the morning sky, he hung there as his aircraft went barreling down in flames. The Yak crashed thunderously. Smoke came climbing up from the wreck as the Russian went floating down. Circling the scene, Erich watched the Russian touch down near his shattered fighter and begin gathering in his chute. German infantry from a nearby village were already on their way to the scene. Fixing the location in his mind, Erich sped back to base and, piling out of Karaya 1, clambered immediately into the squadron's flying jeep, the Fieseler Storch. The versatile little aircraft was used for reconnaissance, forward air control, and rescuing downed pilots. A Storch could land in a minimum of 600 feet and carry 3 people, including the pilot. A Storch was kept ready on the base at all times. Erich took off and a few minutes later landed in a small field close to the village from which he had seen German infantrymen move out toward the Russian pilot. Sure enough, the infantry had captured his late opponent. The Russian was a captain with a kind face. He was obviously happy to be alive. A couple of Romanian civilians who knew a smattering of both German and Russian interpreted for the 2 pilots. Erich congratulated the Russian on his birthday, that is, surviving a downing and a crash. "For you, the war is over. You're lucky," said Erich. The Russian nodded and smiled happily. "Why didn't you look backward after you lost me in maneuvers? And why were you flying alone?" The Russian captain explained that he had lost his wingman in an earlier battle. As to why he didn't look back, the Russian merely shrugged ruefully. The situation was akin to that summed up in the American expression, "Don't look back over your shoulder, someone might be gaining on you." As the young Russian talked, standing there in his dark tunic with leather cap and boots, Erich could see he was just like any other fighter pilot, a member of his own fraternity. He was a carefree young man. He made wings out of his hands when he talked. But for his language and uniform, he could have been German. Erich took his prisoner out of the custody of the infantry, and together they walked out to the Storch and flew back to the squadron's base. With gestures and smatters of Russian, Erich led the young Red captain into a mess tent. Inside were young German men just like himself. The Germans offered the Russian some schnapps and food. To Erich's surprise, the Russian became angry. One of the German pilots spoke a little Russian and discovered the cause of the enemy pilot's obvious rage. They told him that all Russians captured by the Germans would be shot. Erich handed the captain some more schnapps and food, then took him out and let him examine the 109 close up. The Russian was allowed to wander without an escort around the base for 2 days before the squadron had to send him on to Wing HQ for proper processing. Enterprising enough to single out Karaya 1, the Russian pilot had no ambition to escape, although he was left practically unguarded. Air battles like his encounter with the lone Russian brought Erich into contact with every conceivable situation in air-to-air combat. He was not only confident in his own abilities, without which no fighter pilot could ever succeed, but also extended his skills through experience. He could spot aircraft now at phenomenal distances, sometimes minutes before anyone else airborne with him, and often intuit his foe's intentions. He avoided the dogfight in favor of the lethal efficiency of hit and run. The see, decide, attack, break was a sequence never to be broken. Following it meant success, departing from it meant failure and even doom. For joining and breaking combat, Erich developed practical rules that kept him alive and unwounded while the Russian aircraft continued to fall. Under blue sky conditions, he found the best mode of attack the high and fast approach. Where overcast prevailed, he made his strike low and fast. He waited whenever and wherever possible for this one fast blow rather than make his attack under less than ideal conditions. This was his coffee break. Surprise was the crucial element of the successful bounce. In winter, with Karaya 1 camouflaged white and the sky overcast, the low to high attack pass proved extremely successful. He conquered his earlier tendency to slacken speed when closing in, going right to his foe at the shortest possible distance before firing. From 50 yards, the power of Karaya 1's armament was devastating. kills were scored with minimum ammunition. The traditional tactic of turning with an enemy was something Erich had abandoned. Dogfighters could do it their way, and most of them loved the dogfight. Erich preferred his own methods. After his brief and violent attack, he would roll over wing deep and dive about 2,000 feet under his foe if altitude permitted, pulling up from behind and below for a second attack. In this position, he could stay with any turn the enemy might attempt, and after firing, the Blond Knight was on his way upstairs for a third pass should his foe survive the second assault. Each pass was a repetition of the see, decide, attack, break cycle. In the Eastern Front air battles, the Germans were almost always heavily outnumbered. Consequently, Erich himself was often bounced by Russian fighters. In the same way as he evolved his deadly attack tactics, he developed a defensive set of rules. Just as his attack methods rolled up his score past all the old dogfighters, so did his defense tactics keep him from being wounded. The two sets of tactics went hand in hand and led to his being consistently in action. Luck was almost always with him, but his penetrant analytical ability was ever Lady Luck's bridge room. Physical survival and a high score were the children of the Union. When a Russian bounced him from behind to one side and above from the perch, Erich would go into a hard climbing turn, turning into his enemy's firing pass. Where a red pilot came from below and behind, Erich would go hard left or right and down, again breaking into his enemy's pass, then immediately using negative Gs to lose the enemy. Erich's coolness soon became a legend among all who flew with him. He learned to observe his Russian foes as they came into the attack and meet their thrusts with appropriate parries. Resisting the urge to turn while an attacking Russian pilot was still outside firing range required coolness. The concept of simply sitting there while an enemy aircraft rushed in with a battery of guns charged was hard to accept in theory and even tougher to execute in actual combat. Flying straight and level, using the rudder for slight slip and waiting for the enemy to commit himself, soon convinced the Blond Knight that he could avoid being hit under these circumstances. Vital information could often be gleaned in the split seconds before the attacking Russian opened fire. Inexperienced or inferior pilots always gave themselves away by opening fire too early. Erich discovered that in such instances he could soon change his role from defender to attacker, but if the red pilot held his fire and kept closing in, then it was certain that an old-timer was at the controls. A battle was then in the offing. Erich developed only one rule for breaking away as a last-ditch maneuver, and that was to execute a movement where possible with negative Gs. An attacking pilot expects his quarry to turn tighter and try to out-turn him, the classic dogfight. The attacking pilot must turn even tighter in order to pull firing lead on his quarry. As a result, his quarry disappears under the nose of the attacker. At that moment, the quarry can escape by shoving forward on the stick and kicking bottom rudder. The forces on his aircraft changed from +5 Gs to -1 or -1.5 Gs. This escape maneuver is almost impossible for the attacker to see or follow until it is too late. Erich made good use of this escape tactic, which threw the attacker instantly from advantage to complex disadvantage. The attacker was first of all placed at the psychological disadvantage imposed by negative Gs, weightlessness. Physically, he was disadvantaged, being lifted from his seat to hang against his belt, an impossible situation in which to track a target due to the higher negative attack angle. Finally, the erstwhile attacker lost his overview of the area, and steering the aircraft in the right direction for continued pursuit became guesswork. Erich reserved these tactics for last-ditch situations. In all other attacks, his rule was to turn into his assailant's turn using positive Gs. He called these my personal twist regulations, and he taught them to his young wingmen to help keep them alive. His tactical skill in attack and defense took him through more than 800 aerial battles without a scratch, too stunning an achievement to be attributed to blind luck. Once he clarified his tactics and got some experience, Erich's kill tally rose so quickly that he became a subject of discussion among other pilots. His consistent string of victories and seemingly charmed life made him a focus of competitive attention as 1943 wore on. There were even some pilots who thought that there must be some trickery involved in Erich's success. Sergeant Karl Junger of the 7th Squadron, who had flown as Erich's wingman, was invited with 2 other pilots to visit the nearby 8th Squadron mess. This social gathering had a noteworthy sequel arising out of squadron rivalry. During festivities, Jünger heard Erich Hartmann's name mentioned in some of the noisy conversation. Second Lieutenant Friedrich Fritz Obleser, who had come to JG52 about the same time as Erich, had scored well at the outset of his career, while Erich was conquering his buck fever and learning the tricks of Rossmann and the dogfighters. Once Erich settled down to lead his own elements, he rocketed past Obleser to the scoring. Fritz was expressing his skepticism about Erich's consistent skein of skills. Jünger, as Erich's wingman, had been witness to many of Erich's kills. He was annoyed by the implication in Obleser's remarks. The next day, Jünger told the Blond Knight what Obleser had said. Erich thanked Jünger and made up his mind in a flash about what should be done. He went straight to Major Günther Rall, the Gruppenkommandeur under whose command both the 7th and 8th squadrons were operating. Fritz Obleser in the 8th squadron has been saying to other pilots that he doesn't believe my kills are genuine. Rall's eyebrows went up. Well, I know they are genuine. I see the witness reports and all the details. What do you want me to do about it? I would like to have Obleser fly as wingman on a few operations, sir. That is, if it can be arranged. Rall nodded. Pilots locking horns was nothing new to him. Of course, I'll issue the orders. He can come down tomorrow. A somewhat embarrassed Obleser duly reported the following day for duty as Erich's wingman, and since his temporary transfer was for observational purposes, he was assigned to the better vantage point offered by the second element in Erich's Schwarm. He flew 2 missions and saw 2 of Erich's devastating close-in downings in which the Blond Knight blew up his opponent's aircraft. On the ground, the convinced Obleser signed the 2 kill confirmation claims as the official witness. Fritz apologized in manly fashion for his earlier criticism and was allowed to return to the 8th squadron with his story. No further expressions of skepticism about Bubi Hartmann's victories came from any neighboring unit. Behind Erich's tactical skills, which he evolved and polished through experience, lay yet another important talent of the successful fighter pilot, a hunter's nose. He had an instinct for finding his foes even during periods of relative inactivity. As the downing reports kept reaching Rall's desk for forwarding to Wing HQ, he could see that Erich was getting kills when other pilots were coming home empty-handed. So, Bubi was a hunter. On the evening of 1st October 1943, Erich was called to the telephone. Major Rall wanted in on tomorrow's hunt. "What time are you going out in the morning?" said Rall. 7 o'clock or thereabouts. "Good, I will come with you in the second element." Erich Hartmann now tells the story of the only operation the 2 great aces flew together. Rall had been flying down to Zaporozhye every morning early to catch the worm, but with no success. I had been flying later and having success, but I had a special route there. I flew down from Zaporozhye to Nikopol, and near there was a big Russian air base. I had kept my find quiet, but every day I was able to knock an aircraft down in this area. Rall came with me on the morning of 2nd October 1943, and we flew south. We were circling along the front and the line of the Dnieper River. After about 30 minutes flight with nothing in sight, Rall came on the radio. "What are you doing screwing around down here in the south? There's nothing here. I'm taking my element up to Dnepropetrovsk." And so the Gruppenkommandeur lit out. Barely 2 minutes later, I spotted a P-2 recce plane at 18,000 feet with a couple of LAG fighters as escort. I was afraid that Rall would not yet be far away, so I waited until I was closing in on the P-2. Then I called Rall. "I have a bogey south of Zaporozhye and you can watch it. Turn around." Back on the radio came Rall's frantic response. Wait till I get there." By then, I was only 1,500 feet from the P-2. I closed in and shot him down, then broke into one of the legs and sent him down too. Rall saw them both go down burning. Rall's conclusion that the boy was a hunter as well as a shooter was thus proved correct, and the incident shows a certain quality of impishness that Erich Hartmann maintains to this day. The Russian fighter pilots were the most formidable air opposition on the Eastern Front, but the toughest bird in the air, as we have said, was the redoubtable IL-2 Stormovik. The Russian fighter bomber was not as maneuverable as the Yaks, MiGs and Lags, nor as fast, but it could absorb quantities of bullets and shells that often led German pilots pop-eyed with incredulity. Cannon shells and tracer could actually be seen bouncing away from the heavily armored cockpit area of this incredibly tough machine. A Stormovik had been Erich's first victory, and he learned from experience how to bring these rugged birds to earth. The IL-2s flew low, thus protecting their vulnerable oil cooler underneath the fuselage, and a rear gunner harassed attacking fighters. Erich's tactic for tackling an IL-2 with a rear gunner was to make his attack at an angle of 15 to 20 degrees, closing fast and thus keeping the defending gun moving. He never attacked the IL-2 straight or pulled over one after firing. He avoided wounds and damage by rolling hard over one wing and diving under the Stormovik, a maneuver that no gunner could follow with his weapon or score hits. Erich found that there were two main methods by which an IL-2 could be successfully attacked. The lightning strike from below and behind, firing at the Stormovik's underbelly, was the best way to down the concrete bombers. Hits in the vulnerable oil cooler would either force down the IL-2 or set it on fire. When deck-level operations of the Stormovik ruled out this attack method, Erich closed in from behind and tried to concentrate his fire on the wing route, avoiding the armored cockpit and engine area. Repeated cannon hits could cause the heavily loaded wooden tail to shear off and the Stormovik would crash. The two-seater version of the IL-2 proved vulnerable from 10 degrees and below, as a full burst at short range would find its way through the cockpit armor. The IL-2 was followed late in 1944 by the IL-10, an even tougher and much faster bird. These aircraft had to be almost literally hacked down. Before the appearance of the IL-10 and during his prolific scoring period in 1943, Erich scored what were probably the most unusual victories of his combat career against IL-2s. Erich's analytical abilities served him well in the prelude to this battle. He noted that IL-2s generally came from the Russian side of the lines in balls out, straight for the target droves at low altitude. These gaggles often contained up to 60 aircraft and rarely flew above 4,500 feet. Carrying at least two 500-pound bombs under their wings, these aircraft moved relatively slowly and could therefore be easily overhauled from behind. Erich's tactic was to climb to 15,000 feet after takeoff, and from this height he could pick up the enemy gaggles at a considerable distance. Spotting an enemy formation, Erich began a shallow dive, aimed at passing high over the enemy and going in the opposite direction with at least 8 or 10,000 feet between them. Russian pilots looking up could see the German fighters passing above and heading east at high speed. Erich's element would give no indication it had spotted the Soviet formation, whose pilots were lulled into thinking they were unobserved. Erich kept going east for several seconds, after which he would roll his fighter over on its back and smoothly stroke the stick back, executing a half-roll or split-S maneuver. Reversing his direction and gaining speed in the dive, he would drop down to a little below the altitude of the IL-2 formation. If the sky were covered in clouds, he would approach from behind and much below the Soviet aircraft. With his superior speed, Erich could close in for the lethal hammer blows that usually meant destruction for any aircraft. Many Soviet pilots were caught napping by this maneuver. Such tactics were studied on the Russian side of the lines, as the later account of the career of Soviet ace Alexander Prokishkin will reveal. Each new tactic was met by increased alertness and often by counter-tactics. When Erich pulled off this kind of interception near Charkov on a formation of IL-2s, the Russians were ready for him, or so they thought. 4 Stormoviks howling along in echelon right formation passed below Erich as he implemented his well-tried pursuit maneuver. His speed built up rapidly in a dive, and from 200 feet astern of the 4th IL-2 he opened fire, the burst exploding in the IL-2's cockpit. The Russian leader rolled to the left in a split-S maneuver, followed in hair-trigger succession by the other 2 Stormoviks that had not been hit. The altitude-consuming split-S attempt at evasion had disastrous consequences. The bombs slung under the wings of the IL-2s sharply diminished the maneuverability of the concrete bombers, and they had barely 1,500 feet of altitude when they took evasive action. The split-S consumed this altitude in seconds. 4 fiery blasts shook the sky as the entire Russian formation crashed with its full bomb load in the echelon right formation in which it had been flying. 4 ghastly pyres flared in 4 huge debris-strewn craters, and 4 pillars of black smoke united in a single swirling pall above the scene. Erich had fired 1 full burst. 4 victories had followed in seconds. The legend of Karaya I and the Black Devil grew out of such encounters, so devastating to the material and the morale of the Red Air Force. The 7th Squadron history for the period of 10th January 1944 to 22nd February 1944 refers to the Blond Knight in these terms. The most successful marksman during this time was Lieutenant Erich Hartmann. Once in one day, he downed 5, on another day 6. Despite frequent changes of operational base, Erich's tactics and consistent entry into battle continued to build up his score. The 7th Squadron moved to Uman on 22nd February, where a Royal Hungarian fighter squadron was assigned to the 3rd Group of JG-52. On 2nd March, these 2 units were transferred to Kalinovka, then moved on again within hours to a base at Proskorov, where they scored 15 victories before 7th March. The history of 7th Squadron refers to this period. Of these 15 kills, Lieutenant Hartmann alone downed 10 enemies in air combat in one day and thereby achieved his 193rd to 202nd victories. On 2nd March 1944, the Führer awarded Lieutenant Kropinski and Lieutenant Hartmann the Oak Leaf. The Oak Leaves were generally always bestowed personally by the Führer. Erich and Kropinski were ordered to Berchtesgaden for the investiture. Happily, they formed an elite rotte of their own and, squelching through the mud of the Proskorov base, took off for the flight home in a high state of elation. For a few minutes they circled the field, and away to the east Erich could see the morass of mud and snow in which the ground war was being slugged out in inhuman hardship. His thoughts turned back for an instant to the 20,000 German bodies he had seen barely 2 weeks ago, littering a snow-covered valley in the Shandarovka-Korsun salient. Russian cavalry with sabers and red tanks had hacked the trapped German unit to pieces. Erich shuddered at the memory. More similar things must surely lie ahead, for rumors had reached 7th Squadron HQ of a pending Russian mud offensive. Hell was not necessarily hot, thought Erich to himself, as his mind ranged over the infantrymen's war. They fought in a frozen purgatory over which he and his comrades flew in their fast fighters. He was glad to be going home. With the ebullient Kropinski flying beside him, he turned westward with a profound feeling of relief. The riotous journey to Salzburg in the train with Gerd Barkhorn, Walter Kropinski and Hannes Wiese has already been recounted in Chapter 1. The quartet of aces from JG-52 joined 12 other recipients of the Oak Leaves in the ceremonies at the Eagle's Nest. Winners of the decoration included Major Kurt Bühlingen and the Richthofen Wing fighting on the Channel Coast, and the veteran night fighter ace August Geiger, who was later shot down and killed in action by RAF night fighter ace Bob Bram. There were also 2 colonels of infantry. The slender, boyish and slightly tipsy Erich Hartmann was the youngest winner of the Oak Leaves and the lowest ranked recipient of the coveted decoration at this investiture. As 2nd Lieutenant Hartmann, he stood near the end of the reception line, looking like an overawed teenager. On the Russian front, he had already acquired rank and fame of a different kind than that bestowed by the Oak Leaves. He was Karaya I, the infamous Black Devil. A legend had begun around him among his enemies. In his own fraternity, he had qualified for the elite, those who had reached 200 victories. Those few who still stood ahead of him in the deadliest scoring game of all knew that he was the aerial jouster to watch as the war rolled on in its 5th year. So, a few things to talk about. First, in this chapter we learn about the custom paint job that Erich had applied to his plane. I will put a picture of it on screen. This made him recognizable from far away, and as we've heard, it made Russian pilots avoid him. But not being a person that lets an opportunity go to waste, the squadron just assigned the painted plane to new pilots as to keep them safe. Pretty smart move, I'd say. Fun fact about this paint job: after the war, when Hartmann was part of the Federal German Air Force, he had his CL-13 Sabre, a variant of the F-86, painted in the same way, which I find to be pretty awesome. I will put this on screen as well. I like to imagine that maybe, just maybe, there was a Russian pilot who started flying during the war with the VVS and was shot down, with the last thing he saw before bailing out being a 109 with the black tulip paint job. Imagine this man surviving and after the war being transferred to a bomber unit flying Tu-95s over the Baltic, probing NATO air defenses. Now, imagine again, if you will, this man, a grizzly old major by then, seeing a NATO F-86 intercepting him and sporting the exact same black tulip paint job. Had this ever happened, I'm sure the man broke out in a bit of a sweat. Anyway, next, the legendary IL-2. A plane so robust that the Germans called it the concrete airplane, concrete as in the building material. It is, in fact, one of the most built airplanes of all time, surpassing even the 109. The plane was designed with survivability in mind and placed the pilot as well as the engine and the fuel tanks, but not the rear gunner, in an armored tub that was between 7mm and 12mm thick and made even 20mm shells ricochet off of it. The pilot himself was protected by a 64mm or 2.5-inch thick armored glass in the front. About 15% of the entire weight of the airplane was taken up by armor, and it showed. This high level of durability, however, was countered by a rather average combat effectiveness. Usable bomb load was limited and accuracy of the onboard weapons was bad, and not every plane even was equipped with a radio, which made communications challenging at best. But still, the IL-2 was feared by German ground troops and has attained legendary status among aviators and enthusiasts alike, which makes the fact even more sad that only 2 airworthy IL-2 remain today. Also, we hear Erich talk about what he calls the Schanderovka-Korsun salient and the 20,000 German dead that he saw. What he's actually talking about here is the Battle of the Korsun-Cherkassy Pocket, one of the lesser-known yet still remarkable battles of World War II. Here's the picture. By January 1944, the Red Army had pushed westward after the Battle of Kiev and reclaimed much of Ukraine and forced the Wehrmacht to retreat towards the Dnieper. A salient had formed near the towns of Korsun and Cherkassy, held by around 60,000 German troops from the Army Group South, many of them from Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht panzer divisions. The Soviets now saw their chance to force an encirclement, and they took it. Under Marshal Konev and General Valutin, the Red Army launched Operation Thunderclap, a massive pincer movement aimed at encircling the German forces in the frozen heart of Ukraine. By January 28, 1944, this encirclement was completed. 6 German divisions were now surrounded in what came to be known as the Korsun Pocket. Hitler, in a reference to Stalingrad, forbade any form of retreat. Inside the pocket, German forces scrambled to hold ground, food and ammunition were airdropped, but bitter cold and Soviet shelling made survival extremely hard. The Wehrmacht did not sleep on this, of course, so Field Marshal Manstein ordered a relief operation with the goal of linking up and breaking out west through Soviet lines. By mid-February, this breakout attempt began. However, the Soviets anticipated this move and pounded the escaping troops with artillery. Thousands were killed. Historian John Erickson is quoted as such. Under the yellow sky of early morning and over ground covered with wet snow, Soviet tanks made straight for the thick of the escaping column, plowing up and down, killing and crushing with their tracks. Almost simultaneously, massed Cossack cavalry wheeled away from the tanks to hunt down and massacre men fleeing for the refuge of the hills. Hands held high in surrender, the Cossacks sliced off with their sabers. The killing in this human hunt went on for several hours, and a new round opened on the banks of the river Gniloy-Tikich, where the survivors of the first collision of the German column with Soviet troops dragged and fought their way. End quote. Estimates suggest around 36,000 German soldiers escaped, but over 20,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. Now, you may think that this was a massive success for the Red Army, but losses on the Soviet side were staggering, totaling over 80,000 men killed, missing, or wounded. The Battle of Korsun-Cherkassy remains deeply controversial to this day, as the sources on both sides differ wildly in their verdict. Some view it as a minor Stalingrad, a Soviet victory that exposed German weaknesses, while others argue that it was a Pyrrhic success for the Red Army with, as I said, high casualties and a failure to destroy the pocket entirely. German accounts often emphasize heroism under impossible odds, as usual, while Soviet narratives highlight strategic prowess. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in between. In either case, Erich can be thankful to be in a flying machine and not on the ground, and I'm sure he carried the pictures of these swaths of corpses with him for the rest of his life. We will see how he manages this and the constant redeployments in the next episode. Cheers.